Hello, this is Lydia. I'll happily share first. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. I'm wearing a dark shirt. Behind me, there is a fake background of a really tall bookcase that I wish was real and that I actually had, but I don't. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently faculty at Georgetown University, and I'm a longtime community organizer and activist around disability and neurodiversity as an openly disabled, multiply neurodivergent person.
I can go next. This is Jess. I am a white person with short brown, kind of wavy hair. I'm sitting with a comfy like shawl because it got a little chilly in here, and my background is just a couch and a window with some blinds. I am a visiting assistant professor in English at the College of Worcester, and I teach in the areas of feminist disability studies and Native Indigenous literature. And I also do advocacy on access and accessibility in academia, and happy to join Lydia and others today.
I'll go next. My name is Ashley Dawson. I'm a white female with a medium length black hair, blue eyes. Behind me is just posters and stuff. I'm a student at Malloy University, and I'm very excited to be on this panel.
So if one of our panelists would like to start.
This is Jazz. I think kind of looking at the title for this panel, maybe if each of us could kind of explain a bit about our understanding of belonging as it relates to neurodiversity, and I'd be happy to start. So I think it's such a broad term, right? But I think especially when you're thinking of a college campus environment, an academic environment, very often belonging, it can look really different and feel very different, but sometimes it's just a sense that other people, I think of it as a sense that other people anticipated that someone like you might be there. So that's often how I think of access too. For example, if there has been, if there's a flyer for an event and there's descriptive language on there, there's language about access. There's language saying, this is an event designed by disabled people for disabled people. That's the kind of stuff that I find helpful in creating a sense of belonging, just in the sense of like, oh, someone like me had a say in how this was planned and developed. So that's one way that I think belonging can show up, and especially with neurodiversity, that can look really different and broad. And I think sometimes it's also just finding your people, right, within spaces through like whether it's through clubs, whether it's through meeting each other in classes. Lydia and I met through a professional conference, right, and then became friends. And so sometimes that sense of belonging is just having like visual indicators and just reminders that there are queer, disabled people of out there, right, creating different kinds of events and welcoming people like you to them. We could go to Lydia. Do we want to go to you next?
This is Lydia. Sure, happy to. Just heard some odd noise that I was not expecting. And if you ever see me scream and run off camera, it definitely means there's a large spider. This has happened. And I am not afraid to acknowledge my completely irrational fear of spiders. Although possibly not all that irrational, as I have in fact been bitten by spiders more than once. So, arguably it's an incredibly rational fear of spiders, but I digress. We talk often now about the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access. These are commonly used, and I would argue co-opted buzzwords that are incredibly common now for everyone from Walmart Corporation to the US federal government to every philanthropic foundation and every institution of higher education adopting some variation on that formula, and to hire someone as a vice president, as a director, as a coordinator focused on some iteration of DEIA or DEIB or whichever version of that acronym they want to use is. And so consequentially, I don't tend to use that type of language in my own work or in framing what I do and how I conceptualize of my work at intersections of race and disability and sexuality and gender. And instead, I think more about the broader principles of access and of justice. So for me, a question of what belonging might entail is a question not simply of making some shifts or accommodations to institutional structures and practices as they already exist, but rather radically transforming the societal and cultural norms and values that undergird and provide the foundation for those institutional structures and practices in the first place. It is not an environment of welcome or belonging if that environment is one in which there are neurodivergent people welcomed in as tokens, but only so long as they are white and wealth privileged and well behaved. It is not an environment of welcome or belonging if people of color are welcomed with open arms into the institution, but only into precarious adjunctified positions, or into positions explicitly focused on diversity and inclusion, or into positions that are focused specifically on race and ethnic studies, but never anywhere else. It is not an environment of welcome and belonging if an institution is advertising its support for LGBTQ students, and yet trans students are routinely dead named, are not able to even change their name in the registration, and are forced into involuntary medical leave of absence if experiencing a mental health crisis or suicidality because of persistent abuse or lack of safety in the home environment or on campus. It is not an environment of welcome and belonging if disabled people are told you are welcome to attend and can access disability support services and request accommodations, only to have most of those requests denied or met with demands for absurdly expensive and unattainable documentation that disproportionately is much more difficult, if not impossible, to access for disabled people who do not come from whiteness or wealth. So when I think about questions of belonging, I think about questions of what kind of culture we are creating from the outset and whose needs we deem as default, as normal, as acceptable, and who instead we treat as a comfortable, convenient political token until too dangerous, too threatening, too non-compliant, and then are only dispensed with as expendable, as acceptable collateral damage.
I can go next. This is Ashley. So when I think about belonging, I definitely think about my time when I came to picking Malloy as an institution. And even coming from high school, my belonging, I had to think about the community at Malloy and what kind of accommodation services they offered at Malloy and other universities, and that factored into making my decision. Just because from other experiences, I've definitely experienced difficulties with friendships and keeping them and making new friends just because of people being put off by any disability or anything that didn't get displayed to them as completely normal everyday things. And even sometimes I'm like, when I go into choosing different classes or organizations, the belonging aspect comes to me. And I have to think about if I choose these friends, if I choose this class, if I'm going to belong.
Lydia, I think one thing that we should do and have not actually done is clearly define what neurodiversity means, because there are some folks who are here today for whom that might be a newer concept. Neurodiversity is a word that was first coined by Australian sociologist Judy Singer in the 1980s in reference to the reality that all people's brains are not identical, that people think, learn, sense, feel, and communicate differentially, that there are infinite possible variations for the ways in which human minds work. Moreover, neurodiversity has come to refer to the political philosophy and movement that takes this as the impetus for a value statement, that not only is it natural for people's brains to not all be identical, not only is this a readily observable biological fact of human existence, but it is okay, that there is no such thing as a bad or wrong brain, that all people's ways of thinking, that all people's ways of existing are equally valuable and worthy in society. That term, in reference to the neurodiversity movement, is very closely associated with the autistic community and the autistic community's fight for civil rights. But neurodiversity is not solely about autistic people, because neurodivergence, that is the experience of inhabiting a mind that is considered to be in some way divergent from typical, right? Neurodivergence takes many forms. And I'm sure that Jess has this too, but frequently my own students will ask me, do I count as neurodivergent if, and invariably the answer to that question is yes, whether that is, do I count as neurodivergent if I have ADHD? Do I count as neurodivergent if I've been diagnosed with bipolar? Do I count as neurodivergent if we have a family history of schizophrenia and experience of psychosis, and I know that I've experienced trauma? Does I count as neurodivergent if I've been diagnosed with dyslexia or dyscalculia, for example? And the answer to all those questions is yes. All of these experiences are forms of neurodivergence. And less acknowledged, but equally important, are that cognitive disabilities that are related to aging are also experiences of neurodivergence. When aging people develop dementia, they are often becoming neurodivergent in ways that they were not before, whether or not they were already neurodivergent in some form. And a common misconception about the neurodiversity movement and that philosophy of neurodiversity is that those of us who promote neurodiversity do not care about and are not interested in alleviating actual pain, distress, and difficulties that neurodivergent people have. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. The neurodiversity movement believes as a core value that all people deserve support, that all people deserve access, and concurrently, that all people are automatically entitled to innate dignity and to the ability to exercise autonomy as human beings, regardless of what specific ways a person's neurodivergence impacts them, regardless of whether a particular neurodivergent person understands their neurodivergence as a gift or another neurodivergent person hates the way that their brain works and really struggles with it. Regardless of what somebody's experience is, we believe that all people deserve support. And in this vein, the neurodiversity movement is deeply and closely interrelated with the movements for disability rights and the movement for disability justice, in recognizing that all humans have needs and we all deserve to have our needs met. The reality, of course, is that we often do not have our needs met, and that experience of ableism or disability oppression is a differential experience. Neurodivergent people who are Black or Native or Latina or Asian do not experience ableism in the same way as white neurodivergent people. Neurodivergent people who live in the global North, as all of us currently do not have the same experiences as neurodivergent people coming from global South communities. We don't have the same experiences as neurodivergent people who are not currently communicating in a colonizer's language as we are doing right now. And we have friends and colleagues who are dedicated to the neurodiversity movement and to other struggles in disability rights and disability justice globally. And those struggles are existing in incredibly different national contexts, incredibly different cultural contexts. And so within our current national context, as well as beyond it, we do not experience ableism the same way. We experience ableism differentially. And the neurodiversity movement, as informed and guided by certain beliefs and values about human experience and human worth, must acknowledge those realities, but tragically at least in this context, has often failed to do that because, like the disability rights movement, the neurodiversity movement has often been dominated by white, wealth-privileged, Christian, and global North perspectives. And this is in contrast to disability justice, which is a movement deliberately co-created by disabled people at the margins of the margins. And I would argue that the neurodiversity movement needs to be working in concert with disability justice to achieve liberatory aims. And that is in part because of this recognition of a value that all bodies and minds deserve to exist, that there is no such thing as a wrong person, a broken brain. There is no such thing as a person who does not deserve support or who does not deserve access. And that the sooner we can acknowledge that, then the sooner we will be able to carve out space for the infinite possible variations on human existence, and acknowledgement of our brilliant, complex tapestry of human diversity. And I don't mean that in the tokenizing way. I mean that, again, in the literal reality that we are not the same, and that is vitally important to any discussion of justice. We are not the same in our lives, and we are not the same in the structural and systemic realities that we face. So any acknowledgement of the neurodiversity movement has to name ableism as the core problem with which we are contending. The problem is not that, say, autistic people exist. The problem is that autistic people exist in an ableist world. The problem is not that autistic people of color are less likely to be able to be diagnosed, but the problem is in global white supremacy and the medical industrial complex in creating artificial scarcity and hoarding resources only for those who can attain a medical diagnosis, while simultaneously creating a social belief that doctors and psychiatrists should maintain a monopoly in gatekeeping who is neurodivergent, who is sufficiently valid, who is not a faker or a liar or a taker. All of these ideas that are also deeply wrapped up in centuries of white supremacist and settler colonial logic about bodies and minds. I've been on that soapbox for a while, but I did want to make sure we talked a bit about what neurodiversity is, what this term means, and why that is a theme for our conversation. I think it would possibly be helpful for the folks who are here as attendees, if you would like to share in the chat box. I think you can you? Maybe you can't.
Yes, everyone has the ability to ask a question or share in the chat box. Absolutely.
It'd be great. If
And I
folks
can
who are
monitor that.
attending could share in the chat box why you're here at this event, what you're hoping to learn and interested about, that could also be really helpful to do. And lastly, I do want to acknowledge too, I think most people who are here are affiliated with Malloy in some form. And I'm not. I am a bit south of where you are. But if you want to share where you are joining from, then you are welcome and invited to do that, and to share in the chat, as I know that there are a number of you here. So please take a moment to share with us using that chat box where you're joining from, what brings you here, something that you are really hoping to learn. And I'll turn it back over to my co-panelists if any of them would like to talk a little bit about ways in which neurodivergent people have struggled, but have also been able to find success in higher education.
This is Ashley. I just want to add, I'm not neurodivergent in like the typical autism you'd expect. I have a brain injury, so brain being neurodivergent. I want to share that it is rooted in ableism sometimes, and I do have moments where I have to try way harder than typical classmates, and they see it as a negative instead of me trying to do extra work or put in extra study time. They see it as a weakness, and that it's not a good thing that I have to try so hard to do things in classes and around school that are just easier for them.
This is Jess, picking up on some points that Lydia made. I too get that question a lot from my students in terms of the what counts question. And I love Ashley's intervention here, reminding us, right, that traumatic brain injury, that's also a form of neurodivergence. And I think so much of what Lydia was speaking to, right, that question of what counts is really coming from a place of having very narrowly defined ideas of what disability is. Right, like we're taught that what counts, right, is in terms of like what could qualify you for accommodations, right? There's something in that question that it's also getting at the fact that a lot of people who are in college aren't able to actually get the kinds of accommodations that they actually need to really um losing words here, but to really thrive, right? Because accommodations, it suggests that someone needs to have a recognized, right, disability, that they have health insurance and access to go to a doctor or mental health professional, right, to get the kind of documentation that will be believed by the people who issue accommodations at colleges. And so I think we kind of live in this world where we are asked to sort of prove very often like why we should have access to certain things, or sort of prove why we deserve extra kinds of support. And so, right, exactly. Someone in the chat is saying it's also not just about extended time on exams, right? Like there's such a narrow definition, especially in a college environment, of what access might mean, that is kind of like training us to think of like you only count if you have X, Y, or Z, right? And that's something that I think neurodiversity reminds us, is that there are so many ways to be disabled. There are so many ways to be neurodivergent. And just because it doesn't, I'm using air quotes here, but just because it doesn't count in the sense of you are getting accommodations, like doesn't dismiss your lived experience, right? But we're reminded that, and we're really taught that so often. And I think sometimes that removes people from community, right? Just like sometimes having that like permission, like, oh, you count too, right, is like almost necessary for people to feel like this is a larger community that I can be a part of and learn from and support others and receive support in return. I was just reminded too of, I don't know if anyone's attended a talk or anything by the disabled poet and scholar Eli Clare. When he gave a training at the College of William and Mary, where I went to graduate school, he sort of asked us like, maybe not like what, like, don't ask yourself, does this count? But another way to think about it is like, how have you been impacted by ableism, right? He encouraged us to think about that. And if you have a response to that question, right, that can say a lot too about your experience, because there's no one like counting on a clipboard like you count or not, right? And so it really comes down to, as Lydia is reminding us, that so much of our experience and understanding of disabled communities comes from this sense of like what, like having an expansive understanding of what that can include.
This is Lydia. We also got a couple more comments in the chat. As I'm autistic and want to learn more about Molloy's environment for neurodivergent students, as well as engage with other students and communities who are neurodivergent. And Jen added, I love the moments in which we get to enjoy belonging as ourselves, stimming, dancing, talking about our favorite things, and having other people enjoy those experiences with us. It is also about creating a culture of trust when you can resource that experiences of belonging.
This is Ashley. So I myself am in my first year at Molloy, and for the most part, the community here at Molloy has been accepting, and I find myself belonging a little more than maybe other places I've been, like back in high school. I find Molloy's community to really have more parts I belong in here. The only really negative thing about Malay is belonging, and I do hope that in the future it could be better. But again, I mean, Carrie has made it so much easier to belong, and I've also had very wonderful professors, including the wonderful Professor Sgro who organized this. But all my professors have been accommodating, and I have never experienced so far any professors that have said you cannot, use accommodations, I mean, I belong at Malloy, but there is always a part of me that understands how it's not easy for everyone to belong at institutions like this. And if it really wasn't for access here, I don't even know if I'd be at Malloy in the first place, because I had to weigh my options of accommodations when choosing a university. But if it really wasn't for those systems in place, I would have had to drop out. I wouldn't be able to stay here. Even in Malloy and outside, I really would like to see more acceptance. I know today maybe acceptance is a little easier for some people, but outside the world, when I'm with my more visible disability presenting friends, people give them weird stares, and there's a lot of stigma around them. I know one of my friends is around my age, maybe a year or two older, and she is already using a walking aid, and there's a lot of negative stigma with a lot of individuals feeling like she's too young to be using that, and she gets comments all the time. And I've received comments just walking across campus. People, I mean, I've been stopped by maybe some security at school trying to see if I'm drunk, because I mean, I have coordination and balance issues, and sometimes it's late and they kind of see me walking on campus and they don't accept at first my answer, like, no, I have this issue, and they think I'm trying to hide it. So I like to see kind of more acceptance and education. I mean, when I first got my brain injury, I knew I'd have issues with memory coming out of it, or maybe some speech, but I didn't understand at first that balance and coordination and hand-eye things were going to be such a big thing, and I underestimated how much I use them in my daily life, especially with online learning. I wasn't writing, and now I really can't write very well. So there was a lot of stigma, especially with older individuals. I felt that they would comment and frame it in a way that I'm just some lazy kid. And I feel like a lot of things where I have to take breaks because things just take 10 times more work for me, that I always feel like people are viewing me as some lazy kid who doesn't want to put the work in, who doesn't want to try harder. And the truth is, even with learning, I'm putting in as much effort as I can, and people refuse to believe I'm not just lazy because they aren't seeing their desired results.
Hi, this is Jess. Yeah, I was going to add to the question of, I get this question a lot in different ways about how to make classrooms more inclusive. And I think this is something that I often joke, but I'm like, there's not really, like, I can give you a checklist, but also there's not a checklist, right? Like, there's not really a checklist for learn and grow your thinking, right? That is like basically a lifetime experience. But there are things and strategies that I can offer people. And I think the biggest thing is just be aware of what the disability services are in the space where you're working, right? So if you're a faculty member and you have no idea how accommodations actually work other than being on the end where you're receiving accommodation notices, like look into it, like learn about what that is like learn about the fact that students have to go through like all of these hoops to actually get accommodations. And often they don't at the end of it, right? There are a lot of people who are denied accommodations or not given the full extent of support that they actually could benefit from. So just be aware, right? And I think secondly, there's sort of a sense of have in mind, this sounds very basic, but just when you're planning your course, assume that you'll have disabled students in your class, and it may not be obvious to you. It may not be immediately apparent, and they may not disclose to you. But just assume that you will have disabled students there, right? And so that can impact how you design assignments. For example, I'm teaching in an English department now, but I offer different ways of writing essays, right? Sometimes I have students do sort of like almost like a podcast essay where it's audio. And I just have different options. I always have a choice. So for a midterm this semester, I asked students to make a zine, and then they could also write an essay if a zine was just something they couldn't do. So I think just building in flexible options, so there's always more than one choice. And acknowledging directly that if someone has, barriers to doing this assignment in this way, please come talk to me, and I'm open to thinking with you about what might work better, right? And so, and also I think like I do this as a disabled person, but I always start my classes just by acknowledging that like, I know as a disabled person, it's hard for me to exist in this space. And so I just want to acknowledge that all of us are bringing different experiences, and like these academic campuses were not built, right, to anticipate all of our needs. And the way that the academic calendar is set up, right, is not, I was just talking with some students earlier today about how it's not ADHD friendly, right? And just acknowledging that there are a lot of structures in place that we have no control over, but we're sort of like forced to sort of fit in these boxes, right? And so acknowledging just to give each other some grace around that, right? And I know in designing my courses, I take that to be like flexibility. I don't have strict deadlines because I have a lot of students who just cannot submit things on a strict deadline schedule. They need flexibility. And that just acknowledges that a lot of these disabilities, they change day to day, right? You might think you can turn something in on time on a Thursday, and then you have a flare, and guess what? You can't. So I like to build in that kind of flexible options. And for me, that comes from my lived experience. I sort of consider that in how, what accommodations would I want in a class? But I think you can do that as an ally too, right? Like just listen to your disabled students. I think even just bringing it up in terms of how you're talking about how people move through campus, just saying things that indicate you're someone who is thinking about access barriers on campus. You're someone who's thinking about what the experience might be for different kinds of students. And moving through different programs, right? I think just acknowledging it can often send a signal to students like, oh, you're someone who thinks about this. You're someone who's aware that it's illegal, right, to deny someone their accommodations, which is shockingly not everyone knows that. Right, you're someone who's actually thinking about this, and I think that really opens up space for your students to actually be able to talk to you about it. And to feel more comfortable in working with you on accommodations and access and coming to talk to you, because there's a lot of fear, right? As we've heard from people who are here today, students and alumni, right? Like often people won't, as I think Lisa mentioned this earlier, like won't even seek accommodations because of the fear. And that comes from the messages that they're given, right? That comes from people not even being aware that there are different learning styles, right? That might be coming from a disabled experience. And so I think just like, those are some things that can help you kind of shape different ways of thinking about, what counts as participation, what counts as engagement, what counts as rigorous learning. So I'm sure Lydia and others could add more to that, but that's my advice on that matter.
The slogan, "Nothing about us without us," actually comes from South African Indigenous disabled activists and has since become a global export and widely used by disabled activists in a range of national contexts globally. And the basic idea behind that slogan is very simple. It's what it says on the tin, that we should not be making policy, we should not be designing practices, we should not be making decisions, whether about allocation of research dollars or how a curriculum is designed, if it is about disabled people, unless disabled people have a meaningful leadership and decision-making role in that process. That's what it means. And so as that slogan has been adopted by disabled activists globally, it is a call not merely for inclusion, which again is not a term that I tend to use in my work, but a term for revisioning and shifting the structures of power, of shifting the framework away from how things have always been done, away from the status quo, and toward a transformation of how it is that we approach our policymaking and our practices around disability, so that it's no longer the exception to have disabled people participate in a process, or that the most common way for disabled people to be involved in policymaking is in uncompensated, non-empowered, or actively disempowered advisory committees, but instead as fully compensated colleagues, as the principal investigators in research studies, as faculty, as deans, as people in leadership and senior roles in the organizations that purportedly serve disabled people and disabled people's families, until disabled people are in fact making decisions, and those disabled people are not always only the white disabled people or only the wealth privileged disabled people, then we will not have in fact fulfilled the promise that that slogan demands.
Thank you for that question. This is Jess. I can say a little. I don't know if other panelists want to add. I think something that comes up a lot. So one, there's like this interesting thing, at least in terms of autism and neurodivergence, where at least people of my generation were not diagnosed, especially if you were presented in a certain kind of gender marginalized way. And so it's really common for people of my generation, kind of like coming to neurodivergence community and belonging in adulthood after not having had access to support or had the recognition of, we didn't have early intervention, some of us, and then a lot of people did have early interventions, right? Depending on how their disabilities and neurodivergence manifested. And so I think just keeping, I don't know if that really doesn't offer you a concrete suggestion, but I think just having a sense that it can look really different across, which you're probably already seeing undoubtedly, right? Like it looks like neurodivergence and autism and other related neurodivergent conditions can manifest really differently depending on like race, gender expression, class. And sometimes people are overlooked, right? And then there are also, of course, kids that are like hyper subjected to certain kinds of surveillance, like Black and brown kids with disabilities. And so I guess that's all I'll add. Yeah, I can build off of other panelists if anyone else has anything to say.
This is Lydia. There's a comment from Michelle. I believe the path to acceptance is to alleviate fear through education that those that are neurodiverse are differently abled, but very able. The neurodiverse community has a wealth of talent and skills to contribute in many ways. This is Lydia. I do not use the term differently abled. And in fact, years ago, I wrote an essay about why I don't use that term. And there's a few reasons for it. One is the term is not accurate when we're talking about disability because every single human is differently abled. Some people are Beyonce, the rest of us are not. Some people can play Major League Baseball, the rest of us could never. Some people can do things that I will never be capable of doing, and other people are not able to do the things that I take for granted on a daily basis. Literally every human is differently abled, but not everybody is disabled. There are a lot of people, including some who have disabilities and many who do not have disabilities, who feel that the word disability is inherently degrading, that the word disability is derogatory, that it is offensive, that it is a way of putting somebody down, and that it's a negative term and we shouldn't use it. I disagree with that. I will never tell another person what they should call themselves. But I absolutely do not agree that the word disability is one that we should not use or that it is inherently contradictory or mutually exclusive from recognizing and affirming disabled people's humanity. And in fact, if we believe that disability is a natural part of human diversity, as is outlined in the preamble to the Americans with Disabilities Act, if we believe that disability is a social justice issue, then why do we adopt a line of thinking about the word disability or the word disabled that we wouldn't otherwise apply in a social justice context to other terms of identity? So for example, if most people here would not think it was offensive to refer to me as an Asian American scholar, you don't think that it's reducing me only to my race, that it is defining me solely by my race, that it is somehow insinuating that I'm not normal or not acceptable to call me an Asian American scholar, then why are those same arguments leveraged if I'm referred to as an autistic person or as a disabled person? If I'm not a person who happens to be differently racial or sexually different or diverse, then why do so many mostly non-disabled people want to insist on the mental and linguistic gymnastics of coming up with increasingly convoluted euphemisms to refer to my disability and to avoid actually saying the word disabled? And lastly, attempts to avoid saying the word disabled because of fears that it is stigmatizing or derogatory, it inadvertently increase the very same stigma that they are purportedly attempting to avoid. By avoiding using the word disability or disabled, we would reinforce the idea that there is something inherently wrong with being disabled, that there is something inherently negative about having a disability, instead of normalizing disability as a natural part of the human experience. And so I do not use that type of language for the same reason that while I think it is important, as Michelle mentioned, to celebrate what all of us can offer, I don't actually usually take that framework when talking about disability and difference, because I don't believe that a person should ever have to prove that they deserve to belong or to be included. It doesn't matter if a person will ever complete a college degree. It is amazing and important to celebrate when we complete college. It is important for us to celebrate our accomplishments, but we mustn't do so at the expense of disabled people who, for a wide range of reasons, are not able now or perhaps ever to do the same things that I did, or that Ashley is doing, or that Chris or that Jess are doing. That there is no such thing as a condition or a precondition for humanity and for human dignity. For people with disabilities who are not able to hold down a job, who are not able to go to college, who are living on benefits payments for the majority of their life, are also human beings who deserve respect and dignity and autonomy. Disabled people who are non-speaking, who need 24/7 assistance with basic life tasks, who drool involuntarily, are still human beings who deserve dignity and autonomy in the same way that those of us who use speech, who completed college, who do not need 24/7 support, and who are not perceived as grotesque or repulsive according to ableist values. We all deserve the recognition of humanity. We all deserve to be valued as human beings. And so as much as I always want to celebrate our accomplishments, I am reticent to say that we should demand rights, recognition, or appreciation based upon what our abilities are. Because that line of thinking is still reinforcing the idea that there's a certain kind of disabled person who doesn't deserve rights, even if most of us would never say that out loud. It's a type of thinking that we are all taught to internalize, that there's a certain kind of disabled people who do not deserve the same freedom, who do not deserve the same dignity, because in order to achieve dignity or recognition, we have to somehow prove our humanity and worth through what we can do. And I don't agree with that.
Are there any other questions? There's a comment here. It says, I think differently abled ignores the disabling aspects of having a disability. I can be accepted and accommodated while not ignoring that my experience can be disabling. Carrie, you wrote, when we changed the name of our department 2 student surveys and a focus group, several students insisted that we keep the term disability in our name. They said that removing it would contribute to the stigma. And there's another comment as well that says that what Lydia was talking about, it's so important, and that also, like, labeling things as low functioning and high functioning can carry a stigma as well. There's another comment as well that says, as both a neurodiverse and chronically ill person, the term disabled best describes me. I am not just differently abled, I am disabled. I have inherent support needs because of illnesses I have. Thank you.
This is Jess. Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for your comment. I think, right, you're getting at something really important here, right? And I have heard too, that people push back against using the term differently abled because it suggests a level of equality that just doesn't exist, right? That ignores that disabled people have substantial barriers. Like, we're not all on an even plane, right? We have to do so much work to, like, right? There are terms that we use in disabled communities, such as like the disabled tax, right? Which is often referring to the fact that, like, living as a disabled person just inherently costs a lot of money. We have a lot of costs that just don't occur for people who don't have specific support needs. And so I think that's where some of the pushback from differently abled comes too, because it's sort of suggesting that people are equal and we're just each different in our own way, but ignoring the actual, like, oppressive dynamics where disabled people are constantly, you know, are subject to kinds of expenses and a workload that is not the same that non-disabled people and abled people carry.